Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to you all who are joining us on this online media briefing of the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Migratory Species, CMS COP15, and the launch of the interim report of the State of the World's Migratory Species. My name is Aydin Baramluyan. I'm the Public Information Officer at the CMS Secretariat and will be moderating this briefing. Before giving you a run-through of today's media briefing, I would like to inform you that this session will be recorded. Let me introduce today's speakers. Amy Frankel, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Migratory Species. Kelly Malsch, Head of Conservation at UN Environment Program World Conservation Monitoring Center, UNEP WCMC, and lead author of the interim report of the State of the World's Migratory Species. For today's media briefing, the running order will be the following. We will be opening remarks from the CMS Executive Secretary, followed by a presentation outlining the key findings of the report by Kelly Malsch. We will go back to the Executive Secretary for providing an overview of CMS COP15 and its expected outcomes. At the end of the presentations, we will take your questions, so I ask that you hold them until then. Let me just remind that the embargo is now lifted on the press release and the report. To ask questions at the end of the presentations, please raise your hand virtually on Zoom and introduce yourself and the media organization that you represent. You may also be able to submit your questions in writing through the Q&A function of Zoom, which is appearing on the bottom of your screen. After this media briefing, the questions and requests for interviews can be sent to press@cms.int, and we will share that throughout the briefing. Now I'd like to introduce the CMS Executive Secretary to take the floor. I will share my screen for presentations. Amy, you have the floor, please.
Okay, and thank you very much. And Aydin, will you be handling the slides?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much to all who have joined. It's a pleasure to speak with you today. And as Aydin explained, we are having this briefing in advance of our meeting of the Conference of the Parties of CMS, of the Convention on Migratory Species, that will take place very soon, kicking off on 23rd of March in Brazil. We have just two introductory slides. If you go to the first is simply, what are we talking about here? Why are migratory species of wild animals important? Why do they matter? And first is, there's just some short facts here, which is migratory species are wild animals that are found everywhere on the planet, and they include land animals, birds, fish, marine mammals, insects, and some others. They include some of the most iconic species in the world. For example, elephants, whales, dolphins, lions. So people know them, and there are efforts to protect them, but our job at CMS is to assist in the coordinated conservation of these species because of problems that they're facing. Migratory species are absolutely essential parts of healthy ecosystems and a healthy planet. They underpin key ecosystem services, including pollination, pest control. They transport nutrients, and they also provide contributions to climate resilience and mitigation. and of course are a source of nutrition for some communities and people and economies, and provide direct economic benefits, including tourism. Now, because migratory species cross national borders, they require international cooperation for their conservation. So just one slide about who we are. So the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals is a legally binding treaty under the United Nations. We were adopted in 1979, and we are a global framework for wildlife conservation with a vital role in addressing the overall biodiversity crisis around the world. What we try to do is foster international collaboration because one country alone cannot successfully conserve these types of species that move across borders. And we facilitate research, agreements, and actions among the range states, among the governments where you find these species. The Conference of the Parties refers to the governing body of CMS, and that's what we'll be meeting later this month in Brazil. So I think I'm going to hand it now over to Kelly, back to Ideen and then to Kelly. Actually, Ideen, if you want to run through these media points and then to Kelly, and then I'll come back on some outcomes for the COP. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. So as you mentioned, the dates 23rd to 29th of March coming up in Campo Grande, Brazil, will be the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties. And some of the key media moments that I would like to here mention. Next week, we have a webinar on health and migratory species, introducing a new report. The 23rd of March is the opening of the COP, and we will also hold the opening press conference, midday local time, Amazon time. On the second day of the COP, 24th of March, we are launching another major report, which is a global assessment of migratory freshwater fishes. On the 25th, we are launching an initiative. It's a CMS-led global initiative on taking of migratory species, GTI. Then we are launching on the 26th of March a new tool, an interactive map developed by Cornell University, which is the America's Flyway Atlas. And finally, on the 29th, we'll have a closing press release. I now invite Kelly Malsch to go through some of the key findings of the report. Kelly, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to present the key findings of the 2026 interim report on the state of the world's migratory species. So 2 years ago, at CMS COP15 in Samarkand, we established a baseline through the first State of the World's Migratory Species report that was already deeply concerning. Today, the data reveals that things continue to get worse for many of our planet's most mobile species. The interim report that will be launched on the opening press conference of CMS COP15 provides a targeted update on progress. Specifically, we highlight major developments on the conservation status of migratory species, progress towards identifying and protecting important habitats, and recent efforts to map migratory pathways. I'll provide the key messages in the slides that follow. So first and foremost, since our last assessment, the conservation status of migratory species has continued to deteriorate. 24%, or nearly 1 in 4, CMS-listed species are now globally threatened with extinction. This is an increase of 2% since COP14 in 2024. Perhaps more alarmingly, the proportion of species with decreasing populations has climbed from 44% to 49%. All of these insights come from an analysis of data from the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, which provides the most comprehensive source of information on the conservation status of species globally. So to provide a bit more context on this, if you can go to the next slide, Ideen. Our analysis provides the details of the individual species that have changed in status since COP14. So of the 34 CMS listed species that have switched IUCN Red List category between the two reports, 26 have moved to a higher risk category, so from vulnerable to endangered or endangered to critically endangered, for example, indicating a worsening status. A good example to highlight is the buff-breasted sandpiper pictured here, which migrates thousands of kilometers from its Arctic breeding grounds down to South America. This is just one of 18 shorebird species that have undergone severe population declines due to a range of factors, including the loss of non-breeding and stopover sites on migration. On a more positive note, 7 species have improved thanks to concerted conservation efforts. These include the Saiga antelope, the scimitar horned oryx, and the Mediterranean monk seal, reflecting the fact that conservation can work when the approaches taken tackle the underlying pressures head-on, are well-resourced, and are grounded in the local context. Next slide. To fully understand the population trends, we relied on the IUCN Red List, but we also include recent findings from the scientific literature. Based on this, we found that migratory sharks and rays and migratory freshwater fish are 2 groups that have undergone particularly dramatic declines in recent years. Their plight is well known and was featured in the first report, but the latest data reinforces the need for urgent action. For sharks and rays, they're primarily threatened by overfishing, among other threats. And freshwater fish also face a myriad of threats, including habitat loss, but also the construction of dams, which block their migratory routes. This is something you'll hear more about later on in the briefing, as there is a standalone dedicated report on freshwater fish that will be launched at the COP. Other negative trends have been reported for many long-distant migratory shorebirds, raptors, and some species of ungulates or hooved mammals. On a more optimistic note, the latest assessment suggests a more encouraging outlook for many marine turtle subpopulations, again, thanks to conservation efforts, including protecting nesting beaches, reducing direct take, and the establishment of marine protected areas. Next slide. So to fully protect these species, we need to safeguard the multiple different habitats that they need throughout the whole of their migratory journeys. With this in mind, the report compiles information in terms of the key biodiversity areas or these important habitats that are needed for breeding, resting, and feeding. And this is essential for safeguarding these species. We note that there are 9,372 key biodiversity areas, or KBAs, that have been identified as being important for CMS-listed species. In addition, work to identify important areas in the marine realm is also being undertaken. We now have far better knowledge on the marine areas and habitats used by sharks and rays and marine mammals, with identification of hundreds of areas specifically important for CMS-listed marine species having been identified. More work is also being undertaken to identify areas for marine turtles. Initiatives to map migratory pathways are also gathering momentum, and the report highlights a range of initiatives that are making great strides in this area, particularly for ungulates, marine species, and seabirds. While considerable progress has been made in identifying important habitats and mapping migratory routes, more action needs to be taken to protect these areas. 47% of the area covered by KBAs that are important for CMS-listed species is not yet protected. There's still much more to do to safeguard critical sites around the world. In summary, while some individual successes can be celebrated, the overall picture for CMS-listed species is heading in the wrong direction. Looking to the future, there is hope, however. We know what needs to be done. The solutions are known. We highlighted many of these as part of the recommendations provided in the first State of the World's Migratory Species Report. There are tangible improvements in data and mapping, and species recovery has been demonstrated. That said, accelerated efforts to scale up action is urgently needed, and the upcoming COP offers an important opportunity to galvanize a coherent global response to help turn around the fortunes for migratory species. With that, I'll hand back to Amy Frankel to introduce the key themes of the COP. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly. And if I could go to that slide that follows. Okay. So CMS is very much based on science, and thus having that State of the World's Migratory Species report from COP14 was very important to set a baseline of our knowledge. And already, even at COP14 and now at COP15, the parties and partners that work with CMS are prepared to respond. And so there's a number of actions that are teed up for discussion in just a few weeks. Next slide. Okay, first, just to give the broad context, this is one of the most important global meetings for wildlife conservation. It is a United Nations meeting, and it will be a very important gathering of experts and governments for discussing and deciding on actions. There will be strong political leadership from our host government of Brazil. In terms of our agenda, we have a very ambitious agenda with about, I think, over 100 specific items that are being positioned for adoption. And responding to that first report, we have now new scientific findings on key topics, a variety of quite a few additional species that are proposed to be added to the treaty for its protections, strengthened global measures, and very targeted conservation actions. Briefly, in terms of scientific studies, we will have, in addition to this report that we're now discussing, there will be a major new global report on migratory freshwater fishes, and also a deep sea mining report on the impacts on marine species. There are 42 migratory species at risk that are being proposed by various governments to be added to CMS under either one or two or both of our appendices. Among those 42 are well-known species, pretty iconic, the hammerhead shark, the snowy owl, and the striped hyena. So we picked one out of each of the types of taxonomies that we work with. In terms of policy measures, there are many cross-cutting policy issues on the table, including addressing the illegal as well as the unsustainable taking of migratory species, which is a major threat, as we showcased in the 2024 report. Another major threat is bycatch, and particularly of threatened species within fisheries. And that can include both other types of fish, such as sharks, as well as marine mammals, and enhancing ecological connectivity, which gets to the issue of habitat destruction and fragmentation. There are also many focused actions. Just to showcase a few of these, they include species-specific actions as well as geographic, area-wide conservation plans. We're looking at infrastructure, including both on land and the oceans, and as a priority, looking at how we can support the expansion of renewable energy, but minimize negative impacts on species, and also looking at all kinds of issues on pollution and, of course, climate change impacts. And we've had a recent report on climate change and migratory species as well. So I want to just mention some findings that are very important and very timely on deep sea mining. At our last COP, there was a resolution in 2024, very strong resolution on deep sea mining, which essentially urged caution and that we needed to have more information about potential impacts. We were then asked to develop a study to see what are those impacts. And the findings raised many flags, including those that you see here, that there are potential plumes of sediment, wastewater, which can impact animals. There's chronic noise, which can be very disruptive for animal behavior. Habitat loss, which could be very damaging in the long term. Disruption of fisheries and food web. Impacts on sea turtles, seabirds, and other types of species from various associated threats, and essentially very deep concern about the lack of knowledge, and that, whether this type of activity could proceed in the face of such a lack of knowledge. The conclusion is that almost half of the marine mammals, one conclusion, covered by the convention would be impacted, and other particular groups are sharks and rays, which are already known to be among the most in danger of extinction based on the 2024 report, marine reptiles, seabirds, and bony fish. So that's just a brief snapshot of that report, which will be discussed at the meeting. And then I also want to draw to your attention, we mentioned it a few times, that we will be releasing under embargo a very important new report on freshwater fishes. This is a subject that has been neglected under the convention, and I would say globally, there's not been adequate attention to these issues. And without going into detail, the headline message is that vital freshwater fish migrations are collapsing, and hundreds of species urgently need cross-border coordinated conservation action. What might not be known is that some of the longest animal migrations on Earth are actually happening beneath the surface of rivers. So we don't see them, but they are essential to healthy river ecosystems, for fisheries, for food security, for hundreds of millions of people. Finally, the report highlights growing threats and identifies 325 migratory freshwater fish species that might be warranted for addition underneath CMS. So please keep an eye open in the coming days for the news release and materials. And we look forward to discussing the findings with the lead author and myself and others once these are distributed. Over to you, Adine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy and Kaylee, for the presentations. Now, I will invite questions from attendants. Just before, I would like to remind everyone that please raise your hand. You may be also able to, if you want to speak and tell your question, please, before, just introduce yourself and the organization that you are representing. You can also use the Q&A function to write your question, and we'll take them from there. Oh. There is a request for a hand, or so. Maybe we'll start with some online written questions. So I see a hand here. Maybe we'll just go for that. Jayshree Nandi, please, you have.
Hi, my name is Jayshree Nandi. I write for Hindustan Times in India. I just wanted to know, when can we have access to the report on deep sea mining? Is it already public, or when can we have access? And the other thing is this, the findings of this report, the interim report, that's all public now, right? We can release our copies. Thank you.
Sorry, just removing this. Yes. Thank you for your question. Yes, the current report we are discussing is online and the press release as well. And we can share those with you and the participants. We have your emails. I think we can also post them here in the Q&A and you will be able to see them. The deep sea mining report is also available for journalists to view them, and we can share that as well if you would like to see them. So both are available for view. Thank you. So we have another question through the Q&A function. What role can Canada and US play in pushing for a global assessment for migratory freshwater fishes and also for migratory birds mentioned previously? Anushka Yadav, environmental journalist from The Pointer. Maybe I would ask the Executive Secretary to take this question, please.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that question. And the first point is, as you might know, the US and Canada, neither country is a party to the Convention on Migratory Species. However, not being a party does not mean that countries cannot engage with the work of CMS. And in fact, both countries have. The US has been engaging in some of our sub-agreements, which deal with sharks. In fact, we have a global agreement on sharks as well as some other agreements on different species. In terms of the science, in fact, the freshwater fish assessment was done with the help of a major US institution, Cornell University. So there's also engagement that way. And other aspects of the US government have been involved on the bird side. So some of the bird experts of the government, as well as from academic institutions, have also contributed to the work of CMS. So they're actually already doing a lot to enrich the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Amy. So maybe, yeah, I see another question. Busani Bafana, Inter-Press Service. So the report raises alarm that the world's migratory species are in peril since the last COP. What are the main drivers of the species decline, and can science help at this stage? So would you like Kelly to take that question?
Sure, happy to. So within the first State of the World's Migratory Species report, as we highlighted, it was 2 years ago. At that point, we did a comprehensive assessment of the threats to migratory species, and we did find that the two main drivers of species loss, or main threats to migratory species, are habitat loss and fragmentation, and overexploitation through trade and use, and also bycatch. So we know what those threats are, but we also know what potential solutions to these are in terms of protecting key habitats, having protected areas in the right places, which is where the analysis of the KBAs and their coverage of protected areas is an important aspect of this current report, which shows that there is a gap in terms of knowing, the science tells us where these important areas are, but the protection hasn't yet fully covered these areas. Similarly, there is kind of aspects around the overexploitation and take, and one of the key initiatives that will be launched at the COP is this new initiative on international take and use, which perhaps Amy can speak more to. I'll stop there. There are, of course, wider threats in terms of climate change and pollution and others, and barriers to migration. But the two that I mentioned are the key threats that are really driving these declines. Thanks.
Thank you, Kelly. Another question we have in the Q&A from Chiranjeevi from the Deccan Herald, Bengaluru, India. The question is, we now know that wars and conflicts disrupt conservation. Could you please provide any specific case studies to show how migratory species have been hit? I address this to Executive Secretary, please.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. There's no doubt that human conflicts and war and so forth have impacts on animals, nature, and including migratory species. We have not at CMS undertaken any type of assessment in particular on that topic. We're aware that there have been different reports and there might be some studies on this, like particular focused scientific studies, but we have not actually done a study like that. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Amy. So while we're waiting for other questions, maybe a follow-up regarding the previous question is that the report mentions species that are improving. What conservation actions have been most effective in those cases or in future? Would you like to take that question, Amy, maybe?
Sure, I can start, and if Kelly wants to jump in. No, I mean, it's very encouraging, and we'd like to highlight the positive as well as the warning signs. But not all of the species are in decline, and in fact, we've got some very good news on various species that have recovered. And taking a specific example, the Saiga antelope in Central Asia, because I know that one fairly well, and that species was in very serious decline, really to a crisis level due to a number of different pressures, as well as disease, poaching, and habitat destruction. And there was it's also an iconic species for the region. And so the governments of the region, with the support of our convention of CMS and other partners and scientific experts, conservation experts, identified what the threats were, what needed to be done, most urgently, and they came to agreement on this. There was also agreement of the governments to stop any international trade of the species, to make it illegal to take the species, and to start working on issues, the main threats, including the barriers to migration. Even simple fencing was creating problems for these species who couldn't pass through from one place to another. And so that has resulted now in at least one part of its range in Kazakhstan, an enormous recovery of animals to the point where now they are looking at doing some very carefully managed hunting of the species, because it's now at populations where that's sustainable. So that's one very good story. Maybe another is the green turtle, and that's a more global species where, again, it's about bringing together governments, first and foremost, their conservation authorities, as well as the scientific experts that can say, here are the things that are going on, and here are the most important actions. And so, again, there was all great sea turtles are listed under CMS. And so we actually have a lot of very focused work on sea turtles. And it's a great news story where we see the population levels improving because of this type of persistent, collaborative effort, monitoring how we're doing, and then adjusting as needed in terms of the priorities that need to be taken. So we need to look at those stories to know that the work under CMS is paying off, and it might need to be accelerated in some cases. Other aspects, other threats need greater attention, as we've highlighted in these reports.
Thank you, Amy. Maybe another question to Kelly regarding the report. It shows that the share of migratory species with declining population has risen in the past 2 years from 44 to 49%. Do we know what is driving these worsening trends?
Thanks very much. I think it does vary, but a lot of what we saw was that populations that were previously stable, so where we thought things were going okay for these species, that those are the ones that actually we're now seeing declining or decreasing population trends, which is a worry because it's that change in which then can lead to further declines and further movement towards extinction risk. I think with a number of species, particularly on the shorebirds, it does seem to be related to the loss of habitat and kind of the degradation of habitat because they're such long distance migrations that they need these really important stopover sites along the way, which if you picture along coastal areas, there's quite a lot of development in these areas, and it might have both kind of human disturbance from infrastructure, but also human disturbance, just people on the beach. So being really careful about how we interact with species along their routes is going to be key. It does obviously vary if you're thinking about freshwater fish. As we mentioned, there will be a whole nother report on that, but obstacles to migration are a big challenge there in terms of dams and river ecosystems as well. But these kind of early indicators where you see the declining population trends is what we really want to tackle sooner so that we prevent that kind of movement from vulnerable to endangered.
Thank you, Kelly. We have another question from Busani Bafana from Interpress, Zimbabwe. How easy has it been to foster international collaboration in the conservation of migratory species, given a growing breakdown in multilateralism and having countries adhere to legally binding treaties such as the CMS? I would think it's for the Executive Secretary. Amy, please.
No, thank you very much for that question. Every international agreement is slightly different, and in the case of the Convention on Migratory Species, it's in countries' self-interest to work with their neighbors, to work with other countries, because migratory species they move from one country to the next. That's why we have a treaty that focuses on them. And it's a very compelling reason for countries to come together, which is, if they don't do that, then they could lose the species in their own country. So if a country, for example, is relying on a certain level of fish or on Saiga, which I just described, and if they don't coordinate with their neighbors, it can quickly spiral into a situation like the tragedy of the commons, where if there's no agreement, then everyone loses, because we would then lose the viable populations and possibly see extinctions. So I think in the case of CMS, the reason why countries come together is a very compelling reason, and therefore we have seen much less sort of political discussion in our meetings and much more very positive collaboration. I like to call our COPs, people have heard me say this, I call them happy COPs, because we tend to really, if you come to one of our meetings, you'll see that governments and stakeholders and experts and so forth are really looking at solutions. So I think it's a shining light, in my view, of what international cooperation can be about.
Thank you, Amy. Now we have a question focusing on Africa from Akashini Lachana. And if you could identify which organization you are representing, that would be fantastic. So the question is, Africa hosts some of the world's largest migratory freshwater fish systems, including the Congo, Nile, and Zambezi basins. How is CMS ensuring that conservation frameworks for migratory fish translate into concrete protections for these river systems, particularly in the regions where monitoring capacity is limited?
Maybe I'll start on that.
Please, yes, Amy.
So I think this is, as we've noted, there's a major new report on freshwater fish that we're about to launch. And this is a pretty landmark moment as well, because under the Convention on Migratory Species, some of the original species that we were working on were species that are more visible, let's say. So species like elephants, species like big whales, and so forth. Birds. We have actually probably more birds than any other type of species. So lots of attention to those. But of course, many freshwater fish migrate. And so based on the first report that we issued in 2024, we realized that there was a huge gap in our knowledge. And that's why we're so glad that we have this major report that has been prepared, which looks globally. It looks at freshwater fish around the world, and it highlights, in fact, what are some of the most important river basins that we need to be paying attention to. So the report comes at a very, very key moment, because our COP, our Conference of the Parties, will be in an area where freshwater ecosystems are vital, which is in Brazil. And in fact, we're going to be in the state where this particularly unique ecosystem, wetlands ecosystem called the Pantanal is located. But in Brazil, of course, they have a very vast complex of river systems, and some of the actions that our parties are talking about at this meeting are around some of the species that are in Brazil. So for example, and in other countries. So for example, the Amazonian catfish was listed on our treaty a couple of years ago, and now they're following up with an action plan agreed among those countries. So I think that the meeting that's just about to happen in March is going to put a spotlight on these issues. And I think it's therefore a very good moment, for us to look at issues in Africa and elsewhere for this group of species. So please do watch out for this report, because I think it will be quite interesting for Africa as well as other regions.
Thank you, Amy. There was a follow-up question to this, and I think particularly you just responded to that. Are there plans under CMS to support monitoring and research partnerships for regional data platforms on the continent in Africa?
I mean, I think to that, I would say, I think we need to see what comes out of the discussions at the meetings that will happen this month. But the report, does have recommendations, and I think these will be discussed. So stay tuned.
Thank you very much. And the question was from Nature Africa. We have another question from Lucille Gambert, Radio France Internationale. You spoke about sharks, rays, and marine mammals being among the species which are getting worse in terms of conservation status. Can you give us more details on why they are suffering and where, please?
Okay, maybe I can start, and Kelly, if you want to jump in. So going back to the report that we issued 2 years ago, one of the really stark findings was that 97% of CMS listed fish species are globally threatened. And of those, sharks and rays were among the species of most concern when we looked at what's been happening. So it is extremely alarming. And in terms of the threats, one of the greatest threats is bycatch. And, so it's not about these species being targeted intentionally for food and so on, and sale, but it's because they're caught in nets for other fisheries. Now, there's an important step that has been taken in another treaty, our sister treaty, if you will, called CITES, which is another UN treaty that focuses only on international trade of species. And one thing that had been happening is that under CMS, we had some of these species, like manta rays, listed under CMS Appendix 1, which gives a strict prohibition on capture of those species. So you were not allowed to take them. But under CITES, they were on an Appendix 2, which meant that they could be traded legally. And that created a dynamic and really undermined the prohibition under CMS, because if a country could accidentally capture a manta ray, but then sell it in trade, you could see where that incentive created some difficulties. So CITES at its last meeting that just happened at the end of last year has closed that loop, if you will, by actually adding manta rays and a number of other species, other shark species that had a similar situation of disconnect between the CMS and CITES listings. And they have added that to a strict trade prohibition. So I think that's another factor that will help us address those issues. Kelly, I don't know if you want to add on that.
I think you've answered it quite comprehensively. Maybe I'll just say that in the in the interim report, we do provide there's a small section specifically on sharks and rays that summarizes some of the recent kind of scientific reports and literature that have been written around these species. But it is, in terms of the where, it is a kind of something that we're seeing globally in terms of sharks and rays, where the overfishing is impacting them across many different ocean basins. On the marine mammals, I think that when I mentioned them, I was talking about some of the initiatives around mapping areas for marine mammals. So I don't think they're necessarily in decline, or at least it wasn't something that came out prominently in the report. And actually, on the flip side, one of the examples of a success story was the Mediterranean monk seal, which did come out as a species that's improving, which, again, through kind of targeted, dedicated conservation action, where it's recognized what the threat is in terms of the habitat degradation for the pupping grounds, and then action was taken to protect those areas and reduce disturbance for the seals. So I think where the threat is known and things can be done, it can lead to conservation successes.
Yeah, and actually, I wanted to add one other quick note, which is another key policy tool that we have for sharks and rays and other species, which is we've been trying to increase, with partners, mapping of these species. And there's lots of very good improvements in that, where we can track, where these species are going, and also identify what is the most important habitat for those species. And that is absolutely critically important, because that way we can prioritize not only in national jurisdiction, but under the new BB&J treaty that is just coming into force now. So this is a major development where one of the activities that countries will do under the BB&J treaty is to identify important areas on the high seas that need to be protected as marine protected areas. And so we think that with the kind of data that we are gathering that shows which areas are of most importance to sharks, rays, marine mammals, as well as turtles, that will help guide decision makers on those choices for protection.
Thank you very much, Kelly and Amy. We do have a couple of more questions Also from, again, from Nature Africa, focusing on the African continent. So for many African communities, migratory freshwater fish are not only biodiversity assets, but a major source of protein and income. How is CMS integrating food security and small-scale fisheries into its conservation strategies?
And I think we can also talk about the next question on hydropower. The goal of CMS, I mean, the CMS exists for, as we mentioned, for species that migrate between countries. So that's a very first important point. So we don't cover every fish species, but or any other types of species, but they need to cross a border. Why they get listed under CMS is because they're in trouble. So they're either, they need, in addition to being migratory, they need to be of a conservation status, which means that if we don't take action, then they're heading for danger of extinction to some degree. And so that is why countries come and they add different species to our treaty, because they need collaboration or they need a prohibition on taking. So it's not every type of migratory species, that some are doing much better and they don't come under CMS. And then under CMS, the ones that are of, the really endangered species, those are added to our, what's called our Appendix 1, which includes a very strict prohibition on taking of those species. So if they are found in a country that's a party to CMS, that party is not allowed to be taking them and should have regulations in the country to restrict it. And that is the most extreme measure. And it's there because if that's not done, there's a danger that those species really will head towards extinction. The second type of species are those that are not as endangered. They're not endangered. They're at a better conservation status, but they still need cooperation among governments to ensure their long-term survival. For those species, fishing those species is legal. It's absolutely not prohibited under the treaty. Within each country, the countries will look at obviously population levels and if there needs to be more restrictive measures, but the goal of CMS is to bring governments together to try to ensure the long-term survival. And it's very clear that, human activities, including the need for energy, the need for nutrition, have to go in parallel, with conservation. So there's absolutely a need to ensure that we can meet energy needs and food needs and other aspects of sustainable development goals while still doing everything we can to, or as part of that solution, doing everything we can to conserve migratory species, which, as we said in the beginning, are vital. They're vital for our ecosystems, for our many things that benefit human beings and communities. So it's not either or. It's definitely, we need to find smart solutions to these conservation issues while also ensuring that we address poverty and food needs and so forth.
Thank you, Amy. We have 5 more minutes left. Maybe you mentioned bycatch and the issue of overexploitation. So the illegal killing and unsustainable harvesting remains a major issue for migratory species. Are the current enforcement measures working?
Okay. So one of the surprises, I would say, of the findings from our 2024 report was the extent to which overexploitation of migratory species was a threat. We knew that habitat destruction and fragmentation of habitat from roads and other infrastructure and agriculture and so forth, that was a huge pressure on species and on biodiversity loss around the world. But what we didn't realize was that for some migratory species, the biggest threat was actually too much taking out of nature, too much removal, whether it was for intentional hunting or capturing or bycatch. And we've dug deeper into that, and we raised that fact to our parties. And at our last meeting in 2024, they adopted a very strong mandate for looking at what's happening, understanding what's motivating these kinds of takings of species and the bycatch, and then coming with solutions. And one thing they asked us to also do is to develop initiatives with partners, because there is a lot of work on these issues, but what we realized, and after looking at additional science, is something extremely important that has been also neglected, which is the focus has been primarily, the international focus has been primarily on the international trade of wild species and not sufficiently on the taking of species within national borders for national reasons, for domestic reasons. And what the science is showing us is that that threat is actually greater for many, many migratory species. And so with that knowledge, we are going to be launching a major new global partnership, in fact, in a few weeks in Brazil to address this issue. Just to give a very quick explanation, some of the reasons for the taking of these species could involve for sport, lots of bird hunting, millions of birds who are killed around the world for sport and not for food and not for trade. Others can be for sale for domestic markets. It could be because animals are viewed as pests or as a retaliation for human-wildlife conflict, and for other reasons. And so we realize that this is a major gap in our work and in the work of our parties around the world. And so we're shining a very strong spotlight on this topic and expect to have a very strong launch of this event on March 25th, in fact, in Campo Grande.
Thank you, Amy. Maybe we have a couple of more minutes. A final question we take from, again, Lucille Gambert from Radio France International about the Saiga. Which concrete measures have been taken by the governments in order to help that animal, and how long did it take to recover? Maybe Kelly, would you like to take this question?
I can start, but I will also defer to Amy, who I think is probably more of a Saiga expert in particular. But in terms of the report, this was one of the key success stories that came out of the interim report in terms of the species, one of the 7 species that did kind of improve its conservation status over time. Some of the key aspects that were a success for the Saiga was really taking concerted and cooperative action to protect the species, this included protecting key habitats, but also making sure that there was anti-poaching in place. I guess building on what Amy was just saying around the direct take of species, this was a way to really prevent that and to make sure that the species could thrive. The Saiga has a long history of kind of fluctuating population due to kind of disease outbreaks. So ensuring that there's safety measures in place around the species to help build up the population levels following a disease outbreak is really important for the Saiga. So it was really key, particularly in Kazakhstan, where these dedicated efforts were taken to protect the species have made it work. Amy, in terms of the time frame, or if I missed anything out, please add.
Yeah, I'd have to look back. I mean, I want to say it was in the 90s. I mean, there was basically a real plummeting of the population, and but I would want to check that. I would direct you to actually, we have a lot of materials online about that, and we could actually provide more information for you on the precise date. I can't be precise right now, but there was definitely, I would say decades, just in general, in terms of the amount of time needed to recover. But I would say that one of the key ingredient for success was international cooperation. And I think this is a good note to end on, because otherwise we couldn't have done it. And there really was an amazing, we have what we call memoranda of understanding, and these are agreements among governments. And we have a memorandum of understanding for the Saiga antelope. So it brings together all of the range states, all of the governments where you find Saiga. And that also includes non-parties to CMS. And that's, again, a very important fact that we do work, we work across the range of the species. So we invite the, even if it's a non-party government, to the table to agree on priority actions for particular species or groups of species. And we also, in that area of Central Asia, we have what's called the Central Asian Mammal Initiative, which is a broader initiative bringing in more species, not just the Saiga, because there's quite a few species that have this massive migration across the steppes of Central Asia. But they met regularly. They came together. There was the science monitoring population levels. There was good enforcement of taking of those species, and really a willingness to listen to each other, and just very careful step-by-step decision-making before policy changes were made. And so, as I mentioned, just recently, there was support by governments to allow the killing of some Saiga now in Kazakhstan, but to be doing that in a very careful way, very managed hunt, with monitoring and so forth. And I think everyone's going to be watching to make sure that this continues to be a success story. So I think it won't be, I think everyone's paying close attention to see how this goes and make sure that the recovery of the species continues in other populations. But truly, collaboration was absolutely required, and that's what CMS is all about.
Thank you, Amy. We are just a couple of minutes past the hour. We are coming to the end of this media briefing. I would like to thank you all for attending, thanking the speakers, Amy Frankel and Kelly Malsch. Before ending the call, I would like just to remind a few points. So please visit cms.int for our press releases and the reports that have been launched, and for any information about the upcoming conference of the parties, COP15. You can also ask us any questions through press@cms.int. Finally, I would like just to remind again that next week you will receive, watch out for the embargoed press release of the global assessment on migratory freshwater fishes, which is an important assessment coming up. Thank you very much, and have a great day, all of you. Bye.